So, most people, for the past 50, 60, 70, however many years, would not necessarily consider church-going to be a radical thing to do. If anything, church-going in this time frame has been thought of as sort of normal and expected, maybe even mainstream. And you probably don't think of yourself as very radical. Maybe you do, I don't know, some of us might. But the teachings of Jesus in this current day and age are perceived as being more and more out there. And you might say, well, Pastor, there has always been naysayers to Christianity. There are always those out there who won't believe the teachings of Jesus. And that's true. But perhaps what you wouldn't expect is that a lot of those people who don't accept the teachings of Jesus today call themselves Christians. Recently, a former pastor of the Southern Baptist Convention, a guy named Russell Moore, left the church after being at odds with leadership, specifically over issues of the Southern Baptist Convention having a weak response to sexual abuse in their church, and also this increasing tolerance of white Christian nationalism. Now, for those of you who don't know, white Christian nationalism is this idea that the United States should only be for people who are white and people who are Christian, an idea which our church, the ELCA, utterly rejects. But Moore, when interviewed by NPR, raised an alarm bell. In responding to a question of why he left the church, Moore says this. Can we get the slide up there, Ben? Moore says this. Well, it was the result of having multiple pastors tell me essentially the same story about quoting the Sermon on the Mount parenthetically in their preaching, what we heard today, right? Moore continues, parenthetically in their preaching, turn the other cheek. Turn the other cheek. And to have someone come up to them afterwards and say, hey, where did you get those liberal talking points? And what was alarming to me is that in most of these scenarios, when the pastor would say, well, I'm actually just quoting Jesus Christ, the response would not be, I apologize. Instead, the response would be, yes, but that doesn't work anymore. That's weak. And when we get to a point where the teachings of Jesus himself are seen as subversive to us, then we're in a crisis. Now, what I don't want to do here is paint with too broad a brush, but it is alarming to hear some Christians rejecting the teachings of Jesus, specifically these words today, which I would argue are some of the most foundational teachings of Jesus that we have. The lessons from the book of Matthew and Luke that we read to today are known as the Beatitudes, and in them you'll hear the words, blessing for the poor, the hungry, the weeping, the hated, and the reviled. And conversely, you hear this warning to the rich and to the full, those who are laughing now, to those whom people speak well of. And this is a completely upside-down message from what we hear for the world, because usually when we think of blessing, what we think of it in terms of material wealth or success, right? A lot of times you'll hear a football player on Sunday morning say, after they win a big game, like, God blessed me with so much skill and so much ability. Usually we think of blessing in terms of material wealth, power, and success, but Jesus says the opposite. Jesus says that in God's kingdom, it's the poor and the hungry who are blessed. And to be clear, this is actually a pretty radical message. The rich and the powerful in Jesus' day took this as a threat to their own power and wealth. They worried that people would take Jesus seriously and start a violent revolution and upend society. And so they hung him on a cross. Because this message scared them. Right? We don't think about that very often, that this message would be scary, but they were frightened by this message. And to be fair, in a way, Jesus was a threat to their power and wealth, but not in the way that they thought. Right? The way of Jesus was never about violence, but it was about love and compassion and mercy and empathy for those in need. Following Jesus means lifting up the poor, taking care of the neighbor, and welcoming the immigrant. It means using your wealth and your power and your success to become a servant for those who are in need. And it's disturbing to me that to many Christians in our world today, these teachings can be almost unrecognizable. Because what that means is that wealth and power have infiltrated some aspects of the church to such a degree that it's like they've taken a big black marker and crossed out these sections of the Bible, like the Beatitudes, and in its place just wrote the word redacted. Redacted. And the reason for that is that just like in Jesus' day, people who are wealthy and powerful are afraid of these words. So I'll ask you again. Do you think that you are radical for following this Jesus of Nazareth? And whether you answer this question yes or no, more and more frequently today, people who are rich and powerful put that label on people who follow Jesus' teachings because they're afraid of what living out that gospel might look like or do to them. Now, personally, I grew up with these ideas. Loving your neighbor, caring for the poor, feeding the hungry, welcoming the immigrant. So it doesn't always seem terribly radical to me, but apparently it's radical enough to be erased or censored or called weak. So weak that people are afraid of these words, I guess. Maybe the lesson to be learned from this, then, is that this following of Jesus, that we don't always consider to be radical, is quite world-changing. It matters. It matters because following Jesus in an unredacted sort of way is the difference between living in a world where rich and powerful people go unchecked and the poor are denigrated and the hungry go unfed, and living in a world where love and grace and empathy are shown to those in need. There is a world where these things happen when we live them out. And as an unredacted people of God, we should take these words very seriously, because what that means is that the poor, where there are poor and the immigrant and the unhoused, the sick and the hurting are in our communities, God calls us to love those people. And simultaneously, we find ourselves in positions of power, wealth, and success. When we find ourselves in those positions, we're called to use that power and wealth and success not for ourselves, but instead to serve others. So, for example, if you work high up in a business, you might ask, how can I use my position to improve the lives of our janitorial staff or our cashiers or our entry-level workers? Or for all of us, God calls us to consider how we can use our extra income to help the people in our community and the world. Or maybe you don't think or feel like you have any money or any power. Well, still there are things you can do, because you can always go help someone who's in need and clean their house or buy groceries for them, or sit and have a conversation with someone who is lonely, or sit quietly with someone who is grieving. I guess what I'm trying to say is that we all have some kind of power, and how we use that power matters. Friends, we live in a world where the core principles of our faith are sometimes challenged or twisted or redacted, often with an agenda of powerful and wealthy people gaining more power and wealth. And that makes it all the more important that we cling to Jesus' teachings, particularly these Beatitudes today. And I don't know if they'll make you radical or not, but it will make you a follower of Jesus. Thanks be to God.